In 1897, 20 black soldiers pedaled bicycles 1,900 miles from Montana to Missouri, carrying rifles, ammunition, and 60 pounds of gear. They travelled twice as fast as cavalry at one-third the cost. The US Army buried the report. A cavalry horse required 14 pounds of grain and 14 pounds of hay per day. Multiply that by the 900,000 horses and mules the Army maintained in 1898, and you begin to understand the scale of the logistics problem the bicycle could have solved. It required nothing but human legs and a dirt road. The men who proved this received no medals, no recognition, and within 9 years, many would be dishonorably discharged without trial by the same president whose life they helped save in Cuba. This is the story of the Iron Riders, the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps, and the experiment the Army refused to remember. June 14th, 1897. Fort Missoula, Montana, 5:30 in the morning, temperature reading 42 degrees Fahrenheit. 20 soldiers in blue gingham shirts and campaign hats lined up their Spaulding military special bicycles on the parade ground. The sun had not yet crested the mountains to the east. Mist rose from the Clark Fork River a half-mile distant. Each machine weighed 32 pounds empty. Loaded with a blanket roll, shelter tent half and poles, knapsack, Krag-Jurgensen rifle, cartridge belt with 50 rounds of ammunition, mess kit including tin plate and cup, knife, fork and spoon, and 2 days of field rations, the average weight climbed to 59 pounds. Some exceeded 60. Private John Findley, the corps mechanic, carried additional tools and spare parts, pushing his load past 65. The men themselves had been selected for size. Army regulations for the Experimental Bicycle Corps required cyclists weigh no more than 140 pounds and stand no taller than 5 feet 8 inches. The average weight was 148.5 pounds, the heaviest man tipping the scales at 177. Second Lieutenant James A. Moss had obtained special permission for the handful who exceeded these limits. It was the first of many accommodations Moss would extract from a skeptical bureaucracy. These were Buffalo Soldiers, members of the 25th Infantry Regiment, one of 6 racially segregated units formed after the Civil War to fill the ranks of the post-war army, with black enlistees commanded by white officers. Since 1866, these regiments had served on the nation's frontier. They had fought in the Indian Wars against the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Apache. They had chased Geronimo through the Sierra Madre. They had built roads, strung telegraph wire, and garrisoned remote outposts from Texas to Montana. When miners went on strike, the Army sent Buffalo Soldiers to break the picket lines. They were stationed in the least desirable posts precisely because the Army feared racial violence if they were placed near white soldiers or eastern cities. The men lining up their bicycles that June morning had spent years proving themselves to an army that doubted their courage and ability. Now they would test a theory that could revolutionize American warfare. It was perhaps fitting that black soldiers would be the ones chosen to challenge the cavalry establishment. They had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The route stretched 1,900 miles by railroad measurement, though the actual cycling distance would exceed this due to detours around impassable terrain. The Corps would follow the Northern Pacific and Burlington railroads through Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Missouri. Lieutenant Moss had selected this path specifically to encounter every possible condition. High altitudes in the Rockies exceeding 6,000 feet, low elevations on the Great Plains at 1,200 feet, wet climates in the mountains, dry climates on the prairies, the notorious gumbo mud of Montana, the sand hills of Nebraska, and the clay roads of Missouri. If the bicycle could survive this journey, it could survive anything. As the men pushed off that June morning, a light drizzle began to fall. By noon, it was raining in torrents. The clay roads turned to what the soldiers called gumbo, a thick, sticky mud that clogged spokes, jammed chains, and made riding impossible. They dismounted and walked, pushing their loaded bicycles through muck that sucked at their boots and accumulated on their wheels until the tires could barely turn. By evening, after 12 hours of effort, they had covered only 9.5 miles. They went into camp wet, muddy, hungry, and exhausted. The photographer who had accompanied them from Fort Missoula to document their triumphant departure turned back. It was the first day. They had 1,890 miles to go. The experiment traced its origins to a bicycle race. In October 1891, Major General Nelson A. Miles, attended an endurance competition at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Miles was no ordinary observer. Born in 1839 on a Massachusetts farm, he had risen from store clerk to major general through sheer tenacity during the Civil War. Wounded 4 times, he had captured Confederate President Jefferson Davis and subsequently became one of the most decorated officers in the post-war army. He had pioneered the military use of the heliograph, a mirror system for long-distance signaling that he employed during the campaign against Geronimo in 1886. He was a modernizer in an institution that resisted change. What Miles saw at Madison Square Garden fascinated him. Cyclists maintained speeds of 15 to 20 miles per hour for extended periods. Cavalry horses could match this in short bursts but could not sustain it. A horse needed rest, water, and 14 pounds of grain and 14 pounds of hay per day. The logistical tail required to support cavalry was enormous. Every mounted regiment needed farriers, veterinarians, forage wagons, and remount stations. The bicycle needed nothing but a man willing to pedal. In the Outlook newspaper in 1894, Miles declared, quote, "Zero." He envisioned bicycle-mounted infantry for scouting, courier service, and rapid response. He imagined soldiers arriving fresh at the battlefield, their mounts requiring no recuperation, no feeding, no medical attention. The advantages seemed obvious, but the American cavalry establishment resisted. Horses had won the West. The romance of mounted soldiers, from the Rough Riders to the 7th Cavalry, defined military identity. Officers who had spent careers mastering horsemanship had no intention of becoming bicycle mechanics. And critically, the men who controlled procurement budgets often came from cavalry backgrounds. Every dollar spent on bicycles was a dollar not spent on horses. Remember this pattern, it will repeat. Enter 2nd Lieutenant James A. Moss. In 1894, he graduated last in his class from the United States Military Academy at West Point. 54th of 54, dead last. The class ranking system gave top graduates first choice of assignment. Moss had no choice. The Army sent him to Fort Missoula, Montana, a remote posting in the military division of the Missouri. Few officers wanted to command black soldiers in a territory most considered the edge of nowhere. For Moss, it became an opportunity. Moss was born in Lafayette, Louisiana on May 12, 1872. He was 22 years old when he arrived at Fort Missoula in September 1894. He was also an avid cyclist and a member of the League of American Wheelmen, the advocacy group that had been lobbying for road improvements and promoting bicycle use since 1880. He understood the bicycle's potential better than most Army officers. At Fort Missoula, he found Colonel Andrew Sheridan Burt, a Civil War veteran who encouraged his soldiers to stay fit through recreation, including cycling. By July 1895, the fort had hosted a bicycle drill by 20 soldiers as part of the 4th of July program. By fall, Burt reported that 3 officers and 78 enlisted men could ride bicycles. Moss saw his chance. He wrote to General Miles about forming an experimental bicycle unit to test the practicability of the bicycle for military purposes in mountainous country. Miles, now commanding general of the army, gave his blessing. On May 12, 1896, Moss received permission to organize the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps, the first of its kind in the United States. The A.G. Spaulding Company of Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts, agreed to provide the bicycles. Spaulding was then one of America's leading bicycle manufacturers, competing with Columbia for market dominance. They donated 10 machines for the initial trials, seeing the potential for military contracts if the experiment succeeded. The bicycles were 26 inches with pneumatic tyres, steel frames, and Christie anatomical saddles designed for long-distance comfort. They were geared to 66.5 inches, meaning one complete rotation of the pedals moved the bicycle 66.5 inches forward. This was a single-speed configuration with no coasting mechanism. To slow down, you either stopped pedaling against resistance or used the hand-operated brakes. In the summer of 1896, Moss organised his first trial. 8 soldiers would test the Spauldings across Montana's mountainous terrain. They practiced riding in formation, dismounting and remounting in unison, scaling fences up to 9 feet high with their loaded bicycles and fording streams. On August 15th, they departed for Yellowstone National Park, 275 miles to the southeast. The route took them through high passes, across rivers, and over terrain that challenged even experienced riders. 23 days and 797 miles later, including the return trip, they rolled back into Fort Missoula. The trip was a success, though not without problems. The 1896 Spauldings had wooden rims that warped in water and splintered when the men had to ride railroad tyres to avoid impassable roads. The pneumatic tyres punctured on rocks and cactus. The exposed chains collected mud and debris that ground the mechanism. Moss took detailed notes on every failure and every solution. For 1897, he requested steel rims, enclosed chain cases to protect against dust and mud, heavier front forks to absorb rough terrain, and puncture-resistant tyres. The Spaulding Company agreed to provide 22 modified military specials at no cost to the government. In return, they could use the Corps in their advertisements. This deal revealed something important. The Army was unwilling to spend money on bicycles. Every dollar that went to wheels was a dollar that did not go to horses, and cavalry officers controlled the budget. Spaulding understood this. They were betting that a successful expedition would force the Army's hand. They were wrong, but they did not know it yet. By early 1897, Moss had his plan. He would take his bicycle corps from Fort Missoula to St. Louis, Missouri, a distance of approximately 1,900 miles by railroad measurement. The route would test everything: Rocky Mountain passes with grades exceeding 10%, Great Plains heat with temperatures above 100 degrees, Nebraska sand hills where wheels sank to the hubs, Missouri clay that turned to gumbo in the rain. He arranged with the quartermaster's department to have rations delivered to stations 100 miles apart. The standard field ration included flour, baking powder, salt, pepper, dry beans, coffee, sugar, bacon, canned beef, and baked beans. The men would carry only 2 days of food at a time. This was intentional. If they fell behind schedule, they would go hungry. It was incentive to maintain the planned pace of 50 miles per day. The Corps departed Fort Missoula on June 14, 1897. 20 enlisted men, all volunteers, drawn from companies B, F, G and H of the 25th Infantry. Sergeant Mingo Sanders, 39 years old, the oldest and most senior, served as acting first sergeant. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1858, Sanders had enlisted in 1881 and spent his entire career with the 25th Infantry. He was a career soldier with an impeccable record. Lance Corporals William Haynes and Abram Martin, both veterans, led the two squads. Private John Findley, who had worked at the Imperial Bicycle Works in Chicago before enlisting, served as the Corps mechanic. 5 men, including Findley, had ridden to Yellowstone the previous summer. Some of the new recruits had never been on a bicycle before enlisting in the Corps. Accompanying the soldiers were 3 white men: Lieutenant Moss, commanding, Assistant Surgeon James M. Kennedy, a fellow cycling enthusiast who would document medical issues and provide treatment, and 19-year-old Edward H. Booz, a reporter for the Daily Missoulian who would file dispatches along the route. Booz was a freelance correspondent who had not yet completed his degree at the University of Montana. His articles would be reprinted in newspapers across the country, making the Iron Riders famous. Keep the name Mingo Sanders in mind. It becomes important later. The first days were brutal. Rain turned roads to gumbo. The men carried their bicycles on their shoulders through mud that reached their knees. They walked their machines over corduroy bridges that had rotted into the muck. On June 17th, they crossed the Continental Divide in a blizzard. Visibility dropped below 20 feet. Temperature fell toward freezing. Snow accumulated on their campaign hats and soaked through their gingham shirts. They walked their bicycles down the western descent, digging boot heels into the slope to avoid sliding. One wrong step meant tumbling hundreds of feet into a ravine. At night, they camped in wet tents, 2 men sharing each shelter half, on ground saturated with snowmelt. By June 23rd, conditions improved. They reached Billings, Montana, having covered 37 miles that morning alone. The weather had cleared, roads were passable. They were averaging better than 40 miles per day when terrain permitted. At Billings, they picked up fresh rations at the railroad depot and continued east along the Yellowstone River. But roads rarely permitted easy riding. East of Billings, entering the Crow Indian Reservation, the clay gumbo returned. The soil was, as Moss described it, a kind of clay gumbo, and they had an extremely hard time pushing and carrying their bicycles up and down those muddy, sticky mountainsides. They forded the Little Bighorn River multiple times, lifting bicycles overhead as they waded through 3 feet of swift current. The same river where Custer had fallen 21 years earlier now tested black soldiers whom Custer's army would never have accepted as equals. Lieutenant Moss fell ill from alkali water near the Nebraska line. The only potable water came from railroad tanks. Everything else was contaminated with alkali that caused severe intestinal distress. Several soldiers developed similar symptoms. Moss had to catch up with the Corps by train after recovering, rejoining them in Moorcroft, Wyoming. Private Eugene Jones, assigned to Company H, complained so persistently about conditions that Moss sent him back to Fort Missoula from St. Joseph, Missouri. He was the only man who did not complete the journey. The sand hills of Nebraska tested the Corps as nothing before. Deep sand made riding impossible. The men dismounted and pushed their loaded bicycles for miles across terrain that swallowed wheels to the axles. When they found railroad tracks, they rode the ties, a bone-jarring experience that rattled teeth, loosened equipment, and risked bent rims. The July heat was oppressive, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees. Water was scarce and often alkaline. The landscape, Moss wrote, was, quote, too, quote, reporter. Eddie Boos noted they crossed, quote, 3, quote, though remarkably, no one sustained a tyre puncture. Remember these conditions. When the army later claimed the bicycle was impractical, they ignored what these men endured and survived. On July 3rd, the Bicycle Corps arrived in Crawford, Nebraska, where the 9th Cavalry, another Buffalo Soldier regiment, greeted them with 4th of July festivities. The warm reception was notable. Throughout Montana and Wyoming, the soldiers had been welcomed without particular comment on their race. The farther east they travelled, the more racial tensions surfaced, and the stricter the segregation became. In Missouri, a farmer asked if they were Union soldiers. When told yes, he ordered them off his land. Someone from the house shouted that they could camp below the pigsty. This was 1897. The Civil War had ended 32 years earlier, but in former border states, black men in army uniforms still provoked Confederate resentment. The roads across Missouri were the worst of the entire journey. Bad and hilly, with few gravel stretches, they exhausted men already worn down by 6 weeks of continuous riding. The heat remained severe, the last 3 days particularly brutal. Yet spirits lifted as they approached St. Louis. On July 19th, Henry Van Noy Lucas, head of the St. Louis Associated Cycling Club and a wealthy businessman, met the Corps in Laclede, Missouri. He had organized a celebration and sent word ahead that the men were in top physical condition and high spirits. On Saturday, July 24th, 1897, at approximately 6 p.m., the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps rolled into Forest Park in St. Louis, Missouri. Nearly 1,000 local cyclists had ridden out to meet them and escort them into the city. Large crowds lined the streets, cheering the soldiers as they passed. They reached the cottage hotel tired and dusty, their blue gingham shirts faded and stained, their campaign hats battered, their bicycles caked with the mud of 5 states. The Brookfield Gazette had reported that the soldiers, quote for, the St. Louis Star noted the distinctiveness of the visitors, black soldiers on bicycles, something the city had never seen. They had covered 1,900 miles in 41 days, an average of just over 46 miles per day, including rest days. Total cost to Lieutenant Moss personally, $43. The bicycles, despite everything, had performed remarkably. The steel rims requested after the 1896 trials held without warping. Tyres punctured far less than expected. The enclosed chain cases protected the drive mechanism from gumbo that would have destroyed exposed components in days. Private John Findlay kept the machines running with field repairs, carrying spare parts and tools that added pounds to his already heavy load. Moss was elated. The Corps had proven that bicycle-mounted infantry could move twice as fast as cavalry over extended distances at a fraction of the cost. He intended to continue north to St. Paul, Minnesota, testing improved roads before returning to Montana by rail. His request was denied by the War Department. Military interest had waned. The Corps returned to Fort Missoula by train on August 19th, 1897. The bicycles were shipped back to the Spaulding Company. The report Moss submitted to the Adjutant General of the Army in September 1897 made the case for military cycling with precision and data. The bicycle, he wrote, quote 5, the Corps had travelled faster than cavalry could sustain over the same distance, covering ground that would have required weeks of horse recuperation. The trip had cost the government nothing except the soldiers' pay. The trip has proved beyond peradventure my contention that the bicycle has a place in modern warfare. The army ignored it. In February 1898, Moss requested permission to organize a larger expedition, 100 soldiers from Fort Missoula to San Francisco, California. The route would cover different terrain and expose even more of the country to the sight of black soldiers performing with excellence. The request was denied. 2 months later, on April 25, 1898, war with Spain erupted. The 25th Infantry was ordered to Cuba. They departed Fort Missoula on April 10th and would not return. The men of the Bicycle Corps went to war on foot and horseback, not wheels. They fought at the Battle of El Caney on July 1st, 1898, one of the bloodiest engagements of the Spanish-American War. Sergeant Mingo Sanders was partially blinded when shrapnel struck near his eyes. The 25th Infantry helped capture the Spanish fortifications that had pinned down Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. When the Rough Riders ran short of rations, Sanders shared his men's food with them. It was a debt Roosevelt would remember, then betray. In October 1898, now stationed in Cuba, Lieutenant Moss proposed forming a bicycle corps in Havana for rapid response to civil disturbances. In case of riots or other disturbances of any kind, he wrote, a number of cyclists, armed with rifles and rapid fire guns, could be moved to the seat of disturbance with inconceivable rapidity. The War Department rejected the proposal. They were now focused on the Philippine-American War, where the terrain was dense jungle unsuited to bicycles. Moss's request was the last formal proposal for a bicycle unit in the US Army. The experiment was over. Why did the Army bury the report? The official answer was timing. The Spanish-American War required all available resources for conventional operations. The automobile was emerging. By 1913, the Army would adopt the motorcycle, and in 1916, General John J. Pershing would use motorized vehicles to chase Pancho Villa through Mexico. By World War I, trucks would render the bicycle debate moot. But this explanation is incomplete. The cavalry establishment had always opposed bicycles. Officers who had built careers on horseback saw no reason to embrace machines that threatened their expertise and their budgets. The procurement system favoured horses because cavalry officers controlled procurement. And critically, the men who proved the bicycle's worth were black soldiers commanded by a lieutenant who had finished last at West Point. Their success reflected poorly on the assumptions of their superiors. If black soldiers on bicycles could outperform white cavalry on horses, what did that say about the entire military hierarchy? Better to forget the whole thing. The Army made forgetting easy. No medals were awarded. No official recognition followed. The bicycles went back to Spaulding, which eventually abandoned military designs when no contracts materialized. Today, not a single original 25th Infantry military special is known to survive. But history was not finished with the men of the Bicycle Corps. The 25th Infantry returned from Cuba as heroes. They deployed to the Philippines, where they fought again with distinction. Then, in 1906, they were stationed at Fort Brown near Brownsville, Texas. The townspeople resented their presence. Fort Brown had been the site of the last Confederate victory in the Civil War, and the town had no intention of accepting black soldiers as equals. Tensions rose through the summer. On the night of August 13, 1906, shots were fired in Brownsville. A white bartender named Frank Natus was killed. A white police officer was wounded. 12 to 20 men, identified by some witnesses as black soldiers, allegedly raided the town in retaliation for earlier harassment. Every man in the 25th Infantry denied involvement. White commanding officers testified that all soldiers had been in their barracks during the shooting. Army inspectors, unable to identify the shooters, concluded they must have been soldiers based on recovered cartridge casings that matched military-issue ammunition. President Theodore Roosevelt, the same man whose Rough Riders had been saved by these soldiers at El Caney, ordered the dishonourable discharge of 167 men without court-martial, trial, or any opportunity to defend themselves. First Sergeant Mingo Sanders, who had led the Bicycle Corps across 1,900 miles of frontier, who had been blinded at El Caney, who had shared his food with Roosevelt's men when they were starving, was among the discharged. He was 17 months from retirement after 25 years of service. He lost his pension, he lost his benefits, he lost everything except the right to be buried in a national cemetery. Roosevelt waited until November the 7th, 1906, the day after congressional elections, to announce the discharges. Black voters would not have the chance to punish Republicans at the polls. The Brownsville Affair, as it came to be called, sparked outrage among both black and white observers. Senator Joseph Foraker of Ohio fought for years to reinstate the men. Brigadier General Andrew Burt, who had commanded the 25th at Fort Missoula when the Bicycle Corps was formed, testified before Congress that Mingo Sanders was, quote, 9. It made no difference. Roosevelt refused to reverse his decision. Mingo Sanders settled in Washington, D.C., with his wife, Luella. He joined the Masonic Lodge and worked odd jobs. On August 23, 1929, he died at Freedman's Hospital on the campus of Howard University during a procedure to amputate a gangrenous diabetic foot. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, his headstone marking a career of service that his country had tried to erase. It took 66 years for justice. In 1972, the Army reopened the Brownsville case. A new investigation found that the soldiers were innocent, that evidence may have been planted, and that the discharges were unjustified. All 167 men received posthumous honourable discharges. Only one, Dorsey Willis, the youngest of the discharged soldiers, was still alive. He received $25,000. The others received nothing but cleared names that came too late. Lieutenant Moss continued his military career, serving with distinction in Cuba and the Philippines, earning a Silver Star for gallantry in action. He served as acting superintendent of Sequoia and Grant National Parks. In 1917, he took command of the 367th Infantry Regiment, an all-black unit of the 92nd Division that fought in France during World War I. He retired in 1922, having never stopped advocating for military innovation. He authored several books, including manuals on infantry tactics. He never forgot the Bicycle Corps or the men who rode with him. The final irony is crushing. In 1937, Japan invaded China using 50,000 bicycle troops. They moved faster than motorized units on the primitive roads, requiring no fuel depots and minimal logistics. 4 years later, Japanese soldiers on bicycles swept down the Malay Peninsula towards Singapore, outflanking British defenders who relied on roads and trucks. The bicycle, dismissed by the American Army in 1897, proved its military value against forces that had ignored the same lesson. The Swiss Army maintained bicycle infantry units until 2001. Using a design largely unchanged since 1905, the bicycle worked. It always worked. The question was whether anyone would listen. On June 14, 1897, 20 black soldiers departed Fort Missoula on steel-rimmed Spaulding military special bicycles. They carried rifles, ammunition, and 60 pounds of gear. They crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers. They rode through blizzards and heat waves. They pushed through gumbo mud and Nebraska sand. They drank alkali water and went hungry when rations ran short. 41 days later, they arrived in St. Louis, having proven that 2 wheels could outperform 4 hooves at a fraction of the cost. The Army thanked them by burying their report, denying further experiments, and eventually discharging many without honour for a crime they did not commit. The bicycles went back to Spaulding and vanished. Not one original military special survives today. What remains is a story the Army tried to forget. The story of men who were given the worst assignment, the least resources, and the lowest expectations, who took a machine that weighed 32 pounds empty and pedalled it across 1,900 miles of frontier to prove something their superiors refused to accept. They called themselves the Iron Riders because of the iron frames of their bicycles and the iron constitutions required to ride them. The nickname was earned. The Army never earned the loyalty these men gave it. By 1898, the silver mines around Tombstone, Arizona, had produced $40 million in ore. The OK Corral lot, where Wyatt Earp's 30-second gunfight killed 3 men, sold for $600. History remembered the shootout. It forgot the mines worth 60,000 times more. The same arithmetic applies here. The Bicycle Corps proved something worth millions in logistics savings. The Army remembered the cavalry. The Iron Riders are still being forgotten, until now.